and welcome to Module 4, Unit 2 of the Art and Science of Trading. So this topic is rather short but very important, expected value. This may be, many of you may have encountered this before. It's certainly perhaps the fundamental concept in trading math. So if you have seen it before, take a few moments, rethink. Maybe we'll talk about the implications a little bit differently. If this is new for you, this is not difficult to understand, but it's very important. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about how to calculate expected value, think about how much data we need to do so, some cautions and concerns, and then think about how we can apply it and what it means. So what is expected value? Formally, it's a weighted average of all the possible values a random variable can take. And you see the equation here, which, depending on your comfort with equations, may be very easy to read or it may be a little bit scary. So we don't have to spend time on the equation. Let's talk about how to do it. Practically, expected value is the probability of something occurring multiplied by the payoff or consequence if it does occur. So this is something we do every day. When you cross the street in a busy city, if something goes wrong, you could die. So it has a very serious consequence. Similarly, when you get on an airplane, if you have a crash, it could be very bad. The probability of those things happening, very, very small. What's another example? Well, I have some listed here, but just imagine handling a bunch of paper. Unless you have a bleeding problem, if you cut yourself, there's a decent chance you handle a lot of paper, you probably cut yourself. The consequence is annoying, not very serious. So there's this, we consider not only how likely something is to happen, and for many traders, this already moves us thinking in a different direction. A lot of times when we start trading, we're thinking that we want to know what is the most likely thing to happen in the future. Or we're looking for patterns that are going to show us with, quote, some degree of certainty, which doesn't exist, but that gives us a high degree of certainty or confidence that something is going to happen in the future. This points us toward the idea that that's really only part of the equation. The probability is only part. There's more to think about. So if we have a lot of scenarios, we'll look at this in a moment, but basically what you take is the probability of each scenario occurring. And in the case of trading, it would be of a specific win or loss. You would take the probability of that occurring and you would multiply it by the payoff. And I keep writing or loss, but practically a payoff could be negative, which would effectively be a loss. So a probability, by the way, is, you can basically think of it as a percentage, but we want our probabilities to sum to 1. So if there's a 50% chance of something happening, we would multiply the payoff times 0.5. In order to do this, in order to calculate expected value, and this is a problem, we need to be able to quantify, or at least to say we know both the probabilities and the payoffs. From a practical trading perspective, this is difficult. We're not sure. So how would we do this? Well, one way we would do it is we would look at our trading results. Maybe we would look at a back test. Maybe we would look at historical statistics. And then one of the questions is, do we have enough data? So if we're looking at 5 trades, that gives us a different degree of confidence than if we're looking at 100. So one of the questions we ask is, do you have enough data? And then how much is enough? How do you really know this? We'll look at some examples here in a moment. Have you accounted for very unusual situations? For instance, there is a large community of people online who really focus on selling option premium. If you don't know what I'm talking about here, it's not that important. If you do, this will be a good illustration. And if you're selling a lot of option premium, then there is a very small probability that you will have a very, very bad outcome. But if that very bad outcome happens, it could potentially wipe out your trading account, depending on your risk management. But many people, when they think about the probabilities, they don't account for, they don't think about these very unlikely things. And one of the things mathematically we've talked about this in a lot of contexts already, but are your assumptions right? That's something that's always good to ask. So you see here, this is what I've done is this is the number of samples we've taken. So I've generated at this point in the graph, I've generated 11 random numbers. Now the random numbers were drawn from a probability distribution that has a mean of 4.5, which I've outlined here. And one thing that you want to think about is just imagine that you get this first number and it's just a little bit above 2. So the question is, looking at our sample, how sure can we be that the sample reflects the overall average? If we do a lot, the overall average is going to be 4.5 because it's the way I've set up the simulation. But look, for the first 10 numbers, you would have been a little bit confused. And then by the time we get here, you start to have some idea. You know, the average is probably more likely to be here than it is here or here. But we still don't know exactly where it is. What happens if we collect more numbers? Well, look at this. This is very interesting. We're going out to 100 numbers. Now, you've probably been told with your trading that 30 is the number of trades you need. For some reason, that horrible advice is thrown around all the time. And it's glibly written in some trading books. You have a lot of the books that focus on psychology say get 30 trades together and do statistics. Well, here we got 100 numbers together. Now, keep in mind, the average of those numbers is truly 4.5. But look, would you have known that? No. And if these are the point is, if these are your trade results, and if this is your actual average, don't worry about what 4.5 is. It's just a number I picked. You would have, even with 100 numbers, random numbers, which could be trades, not been really sure. Now, of course, if we start to collect a lot of data, then we do converge. And, somewhere at this point, you can be pretty sure. But look how big some of the excursions were. Also, be careful. This is the sort of thing that a lot of statistics books won't show you. This is 10,000 numbers. So I've drawn 10,000 random numbers. And this is from a distribution called a Cauchy distribution, which has no mean. And what if you had been tracking the mean? Can you imagine if you were looking at your trading results and your trading results look like this? By the way, this is not just a random crazy illustration. There are a lot of people who think that these types of distributions probably do accurately reflect financial markets in the long run. So if you're trying to understand market statistics, we think that, let's go back here, we think that generally what we would do is collect more data and probably settle in somewhere around the truth, which is pretty much what happened here. You could, however, have a situation like this. Every now and then you get such an extreme event that you can't be at all sure what's going on in the data. So this is an extreme example, but it might be a practical extreme example. Let's shift directions a little bit. Think about the expected value of a trading system, because that's where we're really going. So practically, here's what you do. You need to know your probability of a win and the probability of a loss. Generally speaking, we will assume this is based on your historical results. Now, maybe the future is a lot different than the past, and in fact, it's in the standard disclaimers that future results may not the past results may not, or past backtesting, past results, whatever you want to think about it, may not accurately reflect the future. It's absolutely true. But for our best assumptions, we usually will assume that the future will look like the past. So you have your probability of a win, the probability of a loss. Be aware that these may not sum to 1. You certainly could have a trading system that is something like a 40% win rate and a 45% loss rate. And you will notice 40 plus 45 does not equal 100. That's because the rest are break-evens. This is the best way to define your overall edge, but do be aware that it's not a comprehensive look. We don't know how the edge is generated. Maybe you're generating this edge through something that is unstable, that is going to not work in the future. We also don't understand what the distribution looks like. Think about that previous example I showed you. We don't understand do your wins and losses cluster. But the way we work this, I don't think I ever actually said this. So you assumed you could read, but you take the probability of the win times your average win, and you add the probability of a loss times your average loss, which should be a negative number. So this will give you the overall expected value of your trading system. Or if you're averaging yourself, if you're doing this calculation on a bunch of systems on your program or yourself. Broadly speaking, there are two ways to win. You can win as a trader through having a high win rate. If you have a high win rate, let's just for sake of argument say 80% wins, this is certainly possible. But the way you get 80% wins will require that your losses are larger than your wins. So you might see some types of traders might have losses that are 3 times their average win. And if you have just been reading trading books, you probably have been told that that is stupid. It's not stupid. It's one legitimate way to win. Another way to win is when I say reward to risk ratio, what I mean is your average trade is many times the size of your average loss. So perhaps our average win is 5 times or 3 times our average loss. If you are a trader like this, then you're going to have a lower probability of a win. Is there any advantage to, and you can pretty much choose how to structure a trading program so you get one of these results. Is there any advantage? Well, perhaps. There certainly could be psychological. Some people need to win a lot. Some people love those big wins. You get to pick. You get to create your system so you can reward your psychology. You might also think, for instance, some trader might be very, very comfortable winning 80% of the time and then having a gigantic loss that wipes out a bunch of wins. For another trader, that might be very demoralizing. You might have a trader that's perfectly cool with a 30% win rate. And he knows he puts on a trade, he has loser after loser after loser, and eventually he's going to get that big home run that makes up for a lot of losses. This is your typical trend following. The trend following approaches look like that. For another trader, that might be soul crushing. He might not be able to handle losing over and over and over. And to some extent, we can train our psychology and adapt our psychology, but we probably, part of understanding who we are as a trader is understanding which of these worlds you would rather live in. There also could be some considerations with the way the particular market you are trading works. One of these approaches, broad approaches, might be better in certain kinds of markets. And also do remember, you need many trades. More than 30. 30, for some reason, is the number that people have in their head. And I've thrown these examples around casually on the previous slide. But you see here that you could have either a very high win rate, but then you're going to have some compensation, a very low win rate, but you also have compensation. And by the way, you can be in the middle. You certainly can be a 50% trader. When people start learning to trade, who would set out to do that? Who would start a trading career and think, hey, I want to be right half the time. I want to be just like a coin flip. Well, that you can make a heck of a lot of money being right 50% of the time if your average win's a little bit bigger than your average loss. That math works out very, very well. Do be aware. And this is, I will kind of highlight this because a lot of the internet scams rely on just absolutely ridiculous statistics. And you will hear people say things sometimes like, we trade with 80% win rate and our average win is 5 times our average loss. Usually they'll say risk-reward ratio, so they'll get it backwards. But just be aware, this is not possible. Why is it not possible? Because the markets are competitive. You've heard this before, right? Because of the rules. Because markets are competitive. You have a lot of people trying to figure out how to make money. There are edges, but they're small, and there's no free lunch. There's no extraordinary edge possible in the market. You got to live in some of these realistic worlds, some of these realistic examples. Just to kind of highlight, because this is so much at the top of people's minds, and you hear this kind of stuff a lot. High probability trading. Everybody will try to sell you, for instance, day trading material saying be a high probability trader. There's no specific advantage to that. There's an advantage to being a profitable trader. There's no specific advantage to being a high risk to reward. You say it backwards, but really you'll hear risk reward, but really they mean the other thing. To have everybody will say things like you have to have 3 times your profit potential to take a trade, or 5 times. Well, it's legitimate for some styles of trading, but it's not possible. It just simply does not exist because of the kinds of edges that are possible. Do be aware that this expected value is an expression of your edge. And just kind of reviewing here, there are no overwhelming edges. It does not exist in the market. If you structure your trading programs, you have a very high win rate, you have larger losses. That's cool. And the same thing is true if you want big wins relative to your losses, you're going to have a low win rate. Just be aware psychology is a consideration, and you certainly, absolutely can live in the middle. Expected value, the sum of all probabilities of all scenarios times the payoff of all scenarios. From a practical perspective for trading system, we usually take the probability of a win times your average win, and we add to that the probability of a loss times your average loss. And obviously this needs to be negative. So if you're expressing, let's just put numbers on it. Let's say your average win, I don't want that to look like I'm adding there. Your average win is $1 and your average loss is $1. Well, you can't add these together because it's just going to be big, right? So this needs to be signed to negative. If it's not, then you make this a negative and subtract. You need to account for all scenarios. Think carefully, understand, and this is something we'll work toward as we think about your trading patterns. Where does your edge come from? How is it generated? Critically, it's essential that this number, your expected value, expectancy is another way of saying the thing, is positive. If you do not have a positive expectancy, psychology, money management, none of this other stuff is going to help you, and we've talked about that before. Most importantly, there is no free lunch. So that's all we have for this short unit. I'll see you back for more soon.